Where's everyone dialing in from?
Oh yeah, where's everyone?
Yay!
It's fun for us. So for those of you who, Eva, where are you dialing in from first?
I'm dialing in from Tenerife in the Canary Islands.
I love it. And I am in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Chicago.
Yay!
Hello. So good to
I
see
spent a
you.
summer living in Chicago. I loved it.
I spent 11 years living in Chicago.
Yay!
Hi, Troy. It's great to see you too, Edmonton. I love it. We're having already four different countries covered. That's
Yeah.
so cool. It's I mean, happiness is definitely, I would say, one of those very ubiquitous topics and something we're interested in no matter where we are in the world. It transcends all countries, cultures, nationalities, all of it. Well, thank you so much. I'll be conscious of the time as everybody trickles in. We'll get started. So, today we're going to be talking about creating a happy workplace and particularly leadership strategies and tying it to retention and growth because probably many of you are here because you know Aoife or you know me and you know just how huge of advocates we are for going through life happier. And not to be completely oblivious that life is always, I would say, rainbows and unicorns because it's not. It's not. There's so many difficult days. But I think for us, in the way that we think about the journey, especially when it comes to work, which it can also be very challenging oftentimes, it's there are different things, very practical things we can do, different mindsets that we can have, different ways that we can work with our teams, and for many of you who are in HR with your organizations to really make a meaningful impact. And the reason why we talked about retention and growth is because it's not this fluffy concept. And recently actually made a LinkedIn post that talked about like, remember some years ago, maybe it's been a decade or so, that a lot of us were very proud to bring the midnight oil and to talk about getting very little sleep. And all of a sudden, we realize how important sleep is for health and that it's not a nice to have, it's not a luxury, but it's something that really is a foundation that helps everything else be better. And happiness is that in many ways. And I think happiness maybe hasn't arrived yet as a concept as much as sleep has. But that's why Eva and I are here to arm all of you who are on this call with data and facts and research questions for how you can make the case for it in your organization as well.
Mm. Dare I
So the
say, Sanja, that I think sometimes people associate happiness at work with something that's quite fluffy and hard to pin down, that there's no data around it, that it's aspirational, that it's not necessarily very practical. But I think that's one of the reasons that we're here today.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because both you and I are researchers and have spent a lot of our career really digging into the data. And while I think both of us, in many ways, are driven by our hearts, we're also very driven by data. So we'll talk about both a little bit today. So we'll be your hosts for the webinar. I'll quickly tell you about myself and about Question Pro, and then I'll turn it over to Aoife before we jump into all of the many data points and slides we have for today, which is a lot. So my name is Sanja Lucina. I am the president at Question Pro Workforce. I'm an organizational psychologist. So again, love all the research, everything inside the organizations from employee listening to leadership development, to training and development, motivation. I've studied all of those concepts and they're very near and dear to my heart. And throughout my career, I've practiced in different roles. And today I've really leaned into employee listening. And I think especially when it comes to happiness in the workplace, there's so much we can learn from people in our organization, from our teams. It's definitely not a one-way concept. It's something that we can influence, but it's a dialogue and it's understanding what are people's particular needs. And Eva will talk a lot more about her framework, but at Question Pro, one of the reasons that we're hosting this webinar and why we're talking about happiness is because one of our business pillars is employee listening or employee experience. We also have research as a huge business area, and that's why you'll see a lot of the data that I'll share today that's proprietary Question Pro research actually comes from market research that we've done through our sister business unit. And then we talk about it in customer experience too. And that will be a whole other topic. But of course, there's a huge relationship between how employees are feeling, how satisfied they are in their job, how engaged they are, and how the company is doing and how their customers are feeling. So we were founded in 2005. We're almost going to be celebrating a 20-year anniversary next year. We are just over 350 employees and we are a global organization. So that's just a little bit about Question Pro and the reason why, again, we're spending time talking about happiness and employee listening today. Aoife, can you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Absolutely. So, if anyone is wondering how to pronounce my name, I always tell people read it backwards. Read it as if it's EFA. So, it's pronounced Aoife O'Brien. It's a very Irish name. I'm from Ireland, but currently based in Tenerife in the Canary Islands. I don't have a nice kind of lovely journey like Sanja described with 350 employees, but I set up Happier at Work back in 2019, and my own corporate journey brought me to where I am today. So I was always highly ambitious. I always loved working, and I had two separate experiences at work that brought me to where I am today. So one of those was a really toxic work environment, and it caused me to question everything. I really lost a lot of my motivation, a lot of my confidence in myself in all areas of my life. Fast forward another couple of years, and I took another role, and it was in this role that I was like, I'm not reaching my full potential. And those two similar but also quite different experiences put me on this path to really understand, well, from an organization's perspective, what can we do to really drive engagement and retention of the people that we have? How do we hold on to them? How do we make sure that they're really engaged in the work, that they're being fulfilled, and that they're reaching their potential? And then from an individual perspective, how do we make better choices when it comes to work, when it comes to how we show up, when it comes to the decisions that we make? So I set up Happier at Work in 2018 after a 20-year corporate career in market research, analysing data, all to do with anything you can buy in supermarkets. So we call it FMCG, fast moving consumer goods, but I know for anyone in the US, it's called CPG, consumer packaged goods. Such an interesting thing and really ticked the boxes on a lot of my different strengths. But I went on to set up Happier at Work and the Happier at Work podcast, of which Sanja has been a guest probably about a year ago. Is it at this
Yeah,
stage or a couple
I
of years?
know. It's
Um,
flown the time.
Talking about working smarter rather than working harder. So, really, really popular episode that she had. The podcast has been going for 5 years now, which is really hard to believe. We have over 200 episodes. So if you're interested in workplace culture or managing your career, definitely go and check out the podcast. I also have the brand Imposter to Empowered. So this is something I became known for in Ireland and starting to kind of get a little bit more known more widely for speaking about imposter syndrome and steps to overcome imposter syndrome. For anyone who wants to connect with me, you can use the QR code there that will take you to my various different social channels, and there's links to the podcast and links to assessments and things like that as well. So that is a brief introduction to me and my
Thank you. And I think, your journey is remarkable. And I think, one out of the many important things to highlight is just how personal it was to you. And I think that happens to a lot of us. We have these particular experiences that really impact us and dictate what we want or guide what we want to spend our time on and the mark that we want to make on the world. And I know, for me, I've gone through different career journeys. And for most part, I've always felt very fortunate and I loved my roles, but not always, right? There were those
mm,
difficult moments. And I think that's like we were saying, it's human, but it guides you for wanting to find a better path. And it guides you
yeah,
to thinking about how do I leave this that's not the chance? And then when I figure things out, like I know one of both of our favorite things is that when we have ideas, when we figure things out, when we have research, we want to share with as many people as
yes, we want
possible
to
because
share it.
exactly.
Yeah,
And
well, this
that's
is,
how you make a difference because
yeah,
people can build off of what our learnings are. So instead of, I always ask others too, I'm like, listen, if you've done something that I haven't tried yet, if you have experimented, can you please tell me? Because I don't want to make your mistakes. I'd love to make new ones that others can learn
yeah,
from. But if I can learn from your learnings and the things that have gone well and things that haven't, then I can lead the path on other things and again help others by sharing best practices and saying like, oh no, I tried that. Maybe it'll work differently for you, but proceed with caution.
Yes. Here's what the road ahead may look like.
Yes. All right. So everyone that's on, grab your pencils, your notepads. We're about to jump into frameworks, a lot of data. This is recorded. We are going to share the slides. So you can take, like, I was kind of joking, kind of serious. You can definitely take some notes, but we will share everything with you. So you will have it as a follow-up. So in this session, what we're going to do is first, we talked about, we promised some real numbers, research, impact on retention. Then Aoife is going to share her framework on happiness throughout the presentation. So we're going to go through different sections. We're going to share some good survey questions to ask, some things we found in market research, why it's important to ask, and then also advice. And then finally, in each section, we're going to go through some practical strategies. Now, listen, we don't expect for those of you who are doing employee listening to necessarily ask every single question to your employees. We don't expect you to take every single piece of advice we share. People are different, organizations are different. This is more of a brainstorm for you to get ideas and then decide what works for your unique organization. But what we'd love is for you to leave a little bit inspired and energized, and then also with a toolkit of some things maybe you didn't think about before that you could do. So the first slide, again, from some external research, because we won't only share Question Pro and our personal one, is why does happiness matter? Why should we be talking about this? If many of you either have a direct line or a dotted line to the CEO and you want to start different initiatives, I can only imagine in some cases and saying, we want to work on this happiness initiative, and the CEO being like, what? How are we? Are we hitting our bottom line numbers? How is actually our business going? So a few external studies and pieces of research. So happy workers show a 13% increase in productivity. And I don't know about you, but I don't know a CEO yet who does not care about productivity or any of the budget holders who would like some more output from their teams. On the flip side, unhappiness at work costs globally 8.8 trillion or 9.9% of the global GDP. Now, that could be a little bit of an abstract number because it's so huge, but the purpose of that study is that it should be shocking and it should be big and it should be something that even if maybe the 13% translates more easily into our own organizations, this shows you the magnitude globally, or if we started to pay attention and make a change, not only how much of an impact it would have for our own organizations, but overall that big trickle effect and impact. And then finally, of course, Gallup has a lot of great data around engagement and productivity. And so from one of their studies, they talk about retention and that a happy and engaged employees at work are 2.5 times more likely to remain at their job than their disengaged employees. Now, one of the things to think about that's also important is that a disengaged employee is not a bad employee. It's not somebody who's a low performer. A lot of times those are the high performers. They maybe just along the way got really frustrated with the lack of tools, really frustrated with the lack of opportunity to grow. Like there's different inputs that we'll talk about, but that can happen to many individuals, especially after a certain hump in the organization, certain tenure. You have the honeymoon period, you're learning new things, you're making an impact. And then what happens if all of a sudden you start to feel that frustration? So these are just a few stats for you to kind of kick things off with and be able to use to get some additional buy-in again for why happiness would be important. So Aoife, tell us a little bit more about your personal framework that you
Yeah,
use in your work.
absolutely. And before I get onto that, I would love
Yeah.
to add that I think I was one of those performers, someone who was performing well in the role, but not really engaged in the organization, not really believing in
Yeah.
what it was that they were doing. But because of that, and this is something I forgot to mention at the start, so I left my corporate role about 6.5 years ago, and I went on and I did some coaching qualifications and a master's in organizational behavior. And it was during the master's I started asking those hard questions. Here's what happened to me at work. What is going on? And one of my lecturers said, well, it could be this issue to do with fit and how you feel this sense of belonging at work. And so I became obsessed with this idea. And from the results of that, and I've added some bits in and I've modified to use my own language as well. I wanted to really understand, well, what are the core drivers of happiness at work? And what I found was there are three pillars. First is values, and values you might understand as being the culture of the organization, how we do things, how things get done, and really understanding whether the values that I have and as an individual are the same as the values of the organization, and are the values of the organization the same as the behaviors that I'm witnessing around me, or is there a mismatch anywhere along the line? And if there's a mismatch, it leads to mistrust, and it makes you kind of question, do I really belong here? Is the behavior of my colleagues the kind of behavior I would expect in a workplace? That can range from anywhere from being really complacent to being absolutely toxic. The second area, then, and we will go into this second area in a lot more detail for the purposes of today. We didn't have time to go through absolutely every part of the framework, but the second part, and probably the least spoken about in the workplace, is this idea of needs at work. And you'll understand more when we go through the different parts of the framework in relation to needs, why balance is so important here as well. Now, if someone had asked me 6 years ago while I was still an employee, Aoife, what are your needs at work? I would be clueless. I would have absolutely no idea. It's not something that we openly talk about. It's probably not something we even think about. However, on the flip side, I think when you feel really frustrated at work, when you feel like you can't do something, that your hands are tied. So, really understanding the drivers behind motivation when it comes to a needs perspective is so, so important to facilitate happiness at work and improving people's workplace happiness. The third pillar then is all about strengths, understanding what your strengths are, being able to use your strengths on a daily basis, working alongside people who have complementary strengths to you. So you're not competing, but you're collaborating, even if you get really frustrated, because I know sometimes if you put the complementary strengths I always think of are people who are visionary thinkers. They think of the big picture, and then those people who are very detail oriented. Sometimes you put those people working together and they frustrate each other so much because they can't really see eye to eye. The detail person is trying to pull the visionary in. The visionary is trying to explain the big picture to the detail person who's not really getting it. So trying to do that and facilitate that in a way that is collaborative is so, so important as well. So understanding what those strengths are and having people utilize their strengths at work. And I know from my own research that there are so many people who feel underutilized, that they're not fulfilling their potential. They have so much more to give. And I know personally that I can relate to this at work as well, not having the opportunity to use my maximum strengths. So these are the three pillars, but all of that has to be underpinned by psychological safety. And I'm sure if you're joining this, that you know what psychological safety is, that you've heard the term before, but really it's being able to speak up without fear of ridicule or judgment, that you can say what's on your mind, that you can challenge the status quo, that you can go against the grain, that you think it's okay to speak up in a meeting, even if there's a very, very important person in the room, that it's okay to share what's going on for you. It's okay to share your ideas. And then overpinned by leadership, because what would these pillars be without the leaders in place who can execute on the strategy of this? So having really good leadership, understanding what that means for you as an organization, what are the qualities that are required, and maybe it's different from your organization to another. There are definitely some attributes that are universal, but maybe in your organization there are some very specific things that you need to be good at in order to excel as a leader there. So this is the overall framework that I use when I'm working with my clients. As I mentioned, we'll be focusing very much on the needs area for the purposes of this due to the limited time that we have today. So we're going deep dive into needs and balance.
Yeah, and if you are interested in any of the other areas, please reach out to Aoife, reach out to myself. Like I'm thinking, Aoife, of all the things that you've shared with me in preparation for the webinar that we weren't able to include. And I know even from the Question Pro end, we've run a couple of webinars before in psychological safety. We have a couple of podcast episodes. So We definitely have a lot of material that relates to the different areas between Aoife and myself. Just again, time management for 1 hour. You can only
Yes,
get in so
I'd
much.
rather I'd rather go deep on one rather than just do like a skim over all of them.
Absolutely. So with that, let's talk a little bit about need satisfaction.
Yeah, so it's definitely worth sharing that this comes from a model of motivation called self determination theory. And these three needs have been found to be universal, which means that everyone has these needs, and there are basic psychological needs at work. So, autonomy is a sense of choice and control over what you do and how you do it. Relatedness, then, is feeling a sense of belonging with those that you work with. But it's also, in addition to that, understanding the relationship between what you do on a day to day basis and the overall performance or the success of the organization. So, finding that impact, understanding why does my job matter and why does it matter that I do my job, understanding the link between you and the bigger picture. And then competence is the third aspect, and that's really feeling capable of doing your job. We will go into those each of those in a little bit more detail now, but just to give you an overview of those three psychological needs, those are our three basic needs. I'm always curious as to why those and not other needs, and we'll talk about unique needs a little bit further down the line. But these are needs that everyone has, but we also have unique needs. The other thing to bear in mind with these needs is that you might have them to different degrees. And maybe you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When I was doing my master's, I was told never reference Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I have since read a really amazing book which is all about how it never was intended to be a hierarchy. Our needs are not a hierarchy. It's not a case of satisfying one in order to have another one be satisfied. So they're not dependent on each other. They're independent of each other. They're not in any sort of hierarchy. One may be more important to someone else. And you can be really sure that the need that is not being met or the need that is not being satisfied currently is the one that is top of mind for your employees right now. So the ones when our needs are met, we probably don't even notice, we don't appreciate it. But when they're not being met, we feel really frustrated. And, I can even feel it now. It's a physical sense in your body when one of your needs is not being met at work. So we can dive into a little bit more detail on each of those needs.
Yeah.
So, first need, autonomy. If you think about autonomy, like one thing that really springs to my mind, cast your mind back to March 2020. Overnight, everyone had all of a sudden a whole load of autonomy. And I think the general perception is that the more autonomy, the better. But actually, what I found from my research is it's not just about satisfying the need for autonomy, it's about finding that sense of balance. So if you have too little autonomy, and I know there'll be a lot of people on this call who are familiar with this because anytime I do research and I ask about micromanagement, most people put their hands up and say yes, or click on the link and say, yes, I have been micromanaged. So too little autonomy, very relatable. You're being micromanaged. You're being told what to do. Being told how to do it. You're being told when to do it. This can also be influenced by back to work mandates. So for 2 years, for 4 years, we had this freedom, we had this autonomy to manage our own workloads. But all of a sudden, we are being told now you have to be in the office 5 days a week, or now you have to be in the office 4 days a week. Don't get me started on the people who moved interstate or who moved abroad during the pandemic, only to be called back to the office. So that is at one end where you don't feel a sense of choice and you don't feel a sense of control over what it is that you're doing or how you're doing it. On the other end, you could feel, and maybe you don't even realize this, you feel a lack of direction. You feel like you haven't received enough guidance. You're floundering, you're flailing about trying to work out which direction am I supposed to be going? What is the expectation of me in this role? Where and you spend so much energy trying to figure that out that it's not as bad as micromanagement, but it's almost as bad as micromanagement. So we need really, really clear expectations placed upon us. And I would always encourage people, if you don't know what the expectation is in your role, if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, what the outcomes that you're supposed to achieve, always ask. I think people are so afraid to ask in case it seems like they're incapable or that they haven't listened or whatever it might be. A huge part of autonomy is this growing level of flexibility that we're seeing in work. And I know, Sanja, you have some really great slides around this idea of flexibility. And I think the one of the things to say about this is the idea that flexibility is not just about when we work. So I'll let you take it away, Sanja.
Yeah, so this is something I was doing extra reading last week in preparation for today because I feel like there's always new research or research we haven't come across no matter how much we read. And this one actually really stuck out to me because I do our employee listening surveys at Question Pro as well. And I've been doing some open-ended analysis on our items. And one of the by and far most frequently cited word and concept when we asked our employees what they like the most about working at Question Pro was flexibility. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And part of the reason why I thought it was really interesting is that was a thread that showed up for a few years. Now, during the pandemic, we were work from anywhere. And people enjoyed that, but then there were a lot of people that were saying, I miss my colleagues. I miss the social time at the office. I like the flexibility. And so now, over time, for particular roles, for particular geographies, we made a strategic decision to ask our employees to come into the office for a certain amount of time. And, we took a step back and we looked and we waited to see, is there going to be friction? How are people going to receive this? And actually, both from data and anecdotal conversations, people received it quite well. But what was interesting, and part of what we're talking about here, is that we need to understand what flexibility is to people. It's something that's really important. But especially like Aoife was, saying, there's a lot of organizations with mandated stuff coming back to office, people looking and saying, is it going to backfire? To me, I think it's, one of the concepts that Eva mentioned at the beginning too is values and organizational values. And so for you as an organization, what do you stand for? And for us, for example, at Question Pro, we wanted to provide people flexibility, but we felt that in certain roles for their own career development, from their learning, for their productivity, being siloed at home was not the best for them, was not the best for their actually personal well-being and for their career. And that's what now, we took a calculated bet. You sometimes you never know how it's going to pan out. But it was really heartwarming for me to see in the survey earlier in the year for us internally, the flexibility still showed up as one of the things that people really appreciated the most. So flexibility does drive greater productivity and work life balance. There are articles, you have one particular study here that talks about it. And then I think a lot of us, know of Adam Grant. And he was also an advocate to really talk about how important it is how we define flexibility and what that actually means. And so I would encourage you to do that inside your organizations, whether you have had, return to office mandates or whether you haven't. Maybe people are still work from anywhere, or work from home, whatever your situation is. Just have that thought and conversation, both if you're in HR strategically, what does it mean for your organization? Or if you're a manager, an individual contributor, what does that personally mean to you? Now, I'll share a few research findings that we found through Question Pro. So, again, we surveyed 10,000, a little bit over 10,000 workers in the US last fall. And Aoife was earlier talking about objectives, right? And so I was really particularly curious, like how many people are going to know what their objectives are? Are people really clear? And 46%, when we asked them, I'm clear about my goals and objectives, strongly agreed. Okay, almost half strongly agree. Still an opportunity, presumably that really could be 100 because it's kind of black and white, when it comes to goal setting. But still, compared to some of our other findings, people tend to know what their goals are. But what was really interesting is then when we started to dig in deeper, just over a third said that they have the necessary tools and resources to complete that work. So maybe you need to see, is the pain point in maybe the lack of clarity of what that objective is, or does it start to go one step below where it's saying, well, I know what I need to achieve, but I don't feel like I have the right resources to do that. And then finally, just again, sprinkling over our findings because we asked about 120 questions in the study, is that just slightly higher, but still only 39% of the workers said they're given flexibility in how they do their job. And now we intentionally worded the question and how because it wasn't necessarily when or necessarily where. It's the flexibility that you as an individual need. So maybe I'm okay to come in an office every day, but I need to come a little bit later because I need to take my son to school and maybe pick him up after. Or maybe I just want to decide how I'm managing my work throughout the day, that I don't have a leader or manager that's above me saying, Sonia, did you complete this? And did you finish this? Like, what are the reasons why they're asking in so much detail? So there is still an opportunity about the goals and objectives, but based on our research, we would say there's even more about what do individuals need to get their work done? And then are they getting the flexibility? What is that flexibility? And are we actually allowing it for them in how they do their work?
There's a couple of things I'd love to add on
Yeah,
there, if I may, Sonia.
absolutely.
And
We'll
this
jump
is
back.
the idea. It's the idea that we do our best work at home. And I think when we suddenly got this opportunity to be able to work from home, we assumed that we did our best work at home. But I think building on your earlier point of some people actually do their best work not when they're on their own, but we have this assumption, or maybe we want to stay at home because we want to avoid a long commute or whatever that might be. And then there's this other idea that when you're in the office, you're doing work, and when you're not in the office, you're not working. And this perception that certainly when I was working in corporate, that's the impression that we had. If someone had to leave early because they had to do a school pickup, and even if they went on later, there was still this perception that they weren't working in the evening because they were at home. They were the only two things. Because I know that it's a challenge for people to get their head around how we are actually showing up, how we're doing work, and work is very different now than it was pre-COVID.
Yeah. And and I think that there's a lot of opportunity for open discussion inside of organizations because there is I think a perception of what our personal circumstances are. And I remember when I was younger and people would leave, sometimes I would think like, oh, it must be nice to be able to, leave a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
And
lucky
then
you.
I know, and then like managing, now I work from home, I manage kids and schedules. And I think some of that is that transparency, communication, people sharing different stories because
Mm.
a lot of times, even, and I would always say, like, I have the best intentions, but I'm only human. When we're not in somebody's shoes, it's hard to understand what they're going through. And it's hard to understand just how their life is set up. And so, for that reason, I think that bringing that to life as much as possible is so important because I think that's as managers, as peers, we'll look for different ways to support each other and we'll look for different ways to be understanding. And I think we've come a long way in the recent years just because there's been a lot that's happened in the world. And I think it's, maybe that's one positive of social media sometimes is that for the people who are open to sharing the good, but also the bad and the ugly, we
Mm.
start to see that other side. We start to see maybe people who we've idolized and thought, they make it look so easy. And all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, wait a minute. So I applaud those of you who are open to that. I know I can probably do a better job. I try to, because I remember when people would say to me, like, oh, like you just take everything on and it's like piece of cake. I'm like, no, 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 it's far from it. It's far from it. And then I like tipped over the other way and started oversharing. But we learn. So I think there is
Balance,
definitely,
balance.
yeah, balance. Exactly. There's that opportunity to find the right voice, but definitely share parts of us so others can help understand what are those circumstances that are different than theirs and what do others need that's not like what they need themselves, especially if you're in a leadership position.
This is it. And when it comes to autonomy, then I've sort of summarized it as direction and control. So it's about providing direction, but then letting people get on with it themselves. And it's really about getting that balance right. So, not too much autonomy, but not too little. But also the knowledge that not everyone is going to be the same. So, each individual will vary. It will vary based on their own personal preferences for how much information they need before they can crack on and do their job, how long they've been with the organization and what level they're at in their career. So you would expect that someone at a more senior level coming into an organization would expect to have a lot more autonomy. But once those guidelines, once that direction is really, really clear, don't don't be afraid to ask for direction or clarification, because oftentimes priorities change, where a lot of organizations are fast moving, and so what was set out at the start of the year may have changed. And I know I've been in the heartbreaking situation of working on a project for a long time, giving it my all, and then being told actually our priorities have changed, and you don't find out until it's too late. So
Mm-hmm.
make sure you're really clear on what needs to happen and when it needs to happen, and if there are any changes. Set really clear expectations. And when I talk about expectations, I always talk about time and quality, and let people do their jobs with your support. So if you can set clear expectations around time, so this is around how long it should take for someone who's starting out doing this type of work. This is around how long it should take for someone who's a bit more expert in this area, who's been doing it for a while. And this is the level of quality that is expected. So this is one of our clients, and therefore it needs to be 99% there. Or this is an internal presentation, so you can get it 80%, and I think we should be okay with that. If you ever have questions around quality, I think people can, like, one of the great things is that there are so many people, myself included. I can just take something to the next level. I'll add in animations, I'll add in pictures, I'll add in all of these things that are unnecessary, but I could spend hours doing that. So if you have a tendency to do that, or if you have someone on your team who has a tendency to do that, why not ask them to check in when they think it's around
Yeah.
80% there or 50% there? And then you can help them by saying, hey, you know what, I think that's finished. Or hey, maybe tweak this and tweak this. And then we're good to go. And you'll save so much time by doing that.
Yeah, and that's that reminded me of our podcast episode, Work Smarter, Not Harder.
Yes.
I'm a huge fan of hard work. However, I remember when I first started my career many moons ago, is I worked so much. I mean, I was one of those people because I loved my job and I felt so lucky to have the role that I had at the time. I just thought, wow, this is incredible. And so I want to make an impact. I want to prove myself. And it was just nonstop, nonstop. And I remember my leader at the time said, like, Sanja, but you need to be very smart about where you focus your time because you can't do everything. So, what's
Mm,
making the biggest impact? What needs to be done? What's the most important? And you know what? Like, it's not always black and white. It's
mhm.
almost never black and white. Like, I feel like I make decisions every day in my role, and I do the best job that I can with the information I have. But it's like, oh, if, fingers crossed that the world around us doesn't change, which inevitably it always does. But it's really having that conversation with your mind around what are the external expectations around my leader, because
Mm,
most of us have leaders, some of us don't, and then aligning our expectations with the leader's expectations are our own. So
yeah,
it's an interesting ever evolving game. And such, I'll call it a game because it makes it feel more fun that way. But maybe an exercise of where and how do we spend our time, and then how do we leverage that autonomy regardless of if we're our own boss and run our own business or somebody else is holding us accountable. So Aoife,
absolutely.
let's talk about relatedness.
So, relatedness, as I mentioned, is this idea that you feel like you get along with your colleagues. And I know certainly I've been in situations where I loved my colleagues. We got on really well. The job was really interesting, but it was the leadership that really like brought the overall company down. And I've been in situations where I felt this is not the right place for me. They just don't get me. They just don't understand where I'm from. I have to check myself at the door. I can't show up as my true self being I like to have fun. I like to make movie references and Simpsons quotes and all those kinds of things. And if people appreciate that, then it's brilliant. And I feel like I get along. Now, relatedness was kind of a hard one to understand where's the balance with, with that, excuse me. But for me, when there's too much relatedness, it can form cliques. So you can have people who are gossiping, people who are, really trying to bond with each other, but in quite a toxic way. So that's when there's too much relatedness. And then at the other end of that, you have the people who are left on the outside of that. So there's the us and them.
Yeah.
And I've definitely experienced this. Typically, it was in organizations I've worked in, and I'd love to know. I haven't seen any people kind of sharing any examples in the chat, but in the organizations I've worked in, it seems to be when you get to a manager level, then you're different, you are other. And it seems to cause this us and them divide. So it's happened to me a couple of times. And the first time it happened, I was on the not a manager because they had opted to promote my colleague to be my boss. And so I was on the other side of that. And then the second time that I really noticed it was when I was promoted. And I felt like my former colleagues were not really engaging with me anymore. So I think in relation to that, it's just noticing these types of things and creating an environment where we feel like we can be ourselves, we feel like we can show up. The other aspect of relatedness, and it's a really important one, is understanding the impact that your role has at work. So making that direct link for your employees to say, this is why your role is really important. And did you know that this is what we achieved as a team, as a department, as an organization, and you contributed in this way? So whether that's a contribution kind of more generally to the results, whether it's an impact that someone had on a client. I know I've always been in client facing roles. So it's always been getting an understanding of what the impact has been on the work that I've delivered. Getting that feedback directly from clients is so, so motivating. But if you can make that really clear and remind people, this is why your work is important, this is how you're contributing, and depending on the type of work you do, you can extend that to the impact that your organization is having more broadly as well. So one of the examples that we spoke about when we were preparing for this is the example of job crafting. And so there was a janitor who was working in NASA at the time of the moon landing. And when he was asked, what do you do? He said, well, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. So understanding the impact that he had. So he was there, he was cleaning every day, and he was able to make that link between how he showed up for work every day and what NASA was able to achieve by putting a man on the moon. So I think it's not too far a leap to get that really crystal clear understanding of the impact that we can have.
Yeah. And I flipped as you were talking to this slide because this is something that really struck me because I think intuitively, if we don't look at research, we think that that sense of purpose, the sense of impact is much easier if you have this exciting job and this big job. But really, a big part of that is mindset. And a big part of that is relationships. And to me, that was so meaningful because not everyone can have a fun job from the standpoint that we are innovating every day and you're doing these huge things personally in your day-to-day job. But like Aoife was saying, your organization might. So when you look at those relationships, when you look at those around you, when you look at the purpose of your organization, the incredible role that you play in it, all of a sudden you can find more happiness that way. It doesn't have to be in your interactions and your activities every day. And to me, as somebody, I'm from former Yugoslavia, from Serbia. I've lived in the US for 20 some years. I lived in London for a couple. I've been in Argentina now for over 9, and moving around so much has really, I think, accelerated the importance I put on relationships because they didn't always come easy. It was something that I had to proactively build. And I realized that a lot of times acclimating in different organizations, if it was a different company culture, a different country culture, a different language, I mean, think about layering all those things. But you don't have to go through such big life shifts to realize. And I was thinking, as if I was talking earlier, like I've been a part of the in crowd and I've been part of the out crowd, and growing up and in work, and you can feel that. You can feel the difference. It's definitely impacts you if you have that sense of belonging or if you don't. And so to be able to consciously work on it or understand where you are, I think is, so incredibly critical. So thank you, Aoife, for sharing that example. Um, I flipped back to one slide prior just to highlight a couple of more things because I think the first one, the first highlight from Harvard Business Review is so important, and maybe a reason why a lot of you here are here today is that building a workplace community is a lot of times an afterthought, right? We need to get our work done. We need to get that. And then let's do something fun. And then let's do team building. And then let's pay attention to relationships. But in many ways, we're overlooking that foundation that, as we saw in the data before, can really help that productivity. So I think it can be an afterthought because it's certainly a leading part of that foundation, a leading part of the indicator. And the second, again, if we need some more stats, is that for people that feel that sense of belonging, a lot of them will say will stay longer with an organization. So a lot of times, the traditional question is, I'm likely to still be working for company X in 2 years, yes or no? And then you start to feel that sense of how long people are going to stick around. Now, at this point, as I mentioned earlier, we had over 100 questions in our market research study. And I got to the point in our conversations with Aoife that we were looking at all of the different questions and what's most relevant to share today. And it was impossible to pick. So we decided to give you a bunch of examples. I know we actually have a lot of Question Pro clients on the call, which makes me so excited. So hopefully you are familiar with this framework. If you're not, let me know. We'll make sure to share it with you and all the benchmark data. And if you're not a client, feel free to leverage these in your research and in your dialogues with your employees. So there are a lot of different ways to get to understanding, relatedness, belonging, and purpose. And what really struck me, and this was like very high level data, it is not, we didn't segment this in this case by industry or age or tenure. We have all of that information, and trust me, we wanted to, but it would have been way too much for today. Is that we're at about a third of where we need to be, which on the one hand is a huge bummer globally. On the other hand, it's a huge opportunity because I know when I look at life, when I look at work, when I look at family, when I look at relationships, all of that, to me, sometimes it gets more frustrating when I feel like I don't have ideas for what I can do, or when I feel like I've arrived at something, or I've given it my all, or I feel like I'm getting all the sleep that I need, I'm drinking all the water. Why is my health not better? So I guess one of the optimistic ways to look at this data is that we still have an opportunity as a society to improve where we are, where we stand. So, one, and just the general belonging question, my organization making me feel like belong. I find my job meaningful and fulfilling. I think that's a really big one. And I won't read all of them to you. I'll leave that to you and to take it away. But I think looking at items like I'm satisfied with the relationships I have with others at work is really important because, again, from everything that we've seen in the research before and based on Aoife's model, that is critical. It's critical to how we get things done. It's critical to our happiness. And then being able to peel back for those individuals who are saying, I don't really feel like I have those relationships. Is it because of lack of interaction? Is it because of a tough manager? Is it because of being siloed? Maybe those are the individuals who are working from home and that's not a good setup for them. So each one of these questions, I think, has a lot of additional action items that can be taken from it. And then of course we included a good friend at work, maybe not the best friend at work, but somebody that you feel like you can relate to. And in our full measure, we have more items around having conversations, having similar interests. And again, we include those because it helps you peel back the onion a little bit more to understand if some items are scoring lower the why behind it, but at a very basic, at least high level, these are some of the things that you can ask inside your organization to start to pinpoint where could be your unique opportunities to improve and where are some of your unique strengths that you can really lean into to make sure people are feeling that relatedness, belonging, and sense of purpose. If anything you'd add here before we go to the
I
next slide?
Well, interestingly, no, I listened to a podcast a number of years ago with Adam Grant. I'm also a huge fan of Adam Grant. I love his work. I think he makes organizational psychology so accessible. And one of the things that he talked about was this idea of purpose and big P, little p purpose. So we often think that when we have a purpose, it needs to be this big thing. I think the example he used was save the whales. You know, we think it needs to be this big, grand, global impact thing. But actually, if you take that as little p purpose, it's the daily interactions that you have, it's the impact that you have on those people around you, whether it's colleagues, whether it's the community that you work in. So it's bringing it back down from a global, we need to have something huge, to think about what the impact that you have
Yeah.
is. Can think about what is the impact that you have on those around you at a community level rather than at a global level.
Yeah, I love that. I love the accessibility and understanding where your impact could be. It doesn't have to be this huge
Absolutely.
revolutionary thing.
Yeah. So when it comes to relatedness, then it's really about connection and contribution. How are you connecting with others in the organization? How do you understand that contribution? So whether you ask this of yourself or whether you encourage your team to ask themselves, it's really about, do I feel like I belong at my organization? You need to be really clear with your employees about their contribution to the team, to the department, the organization's objectives, or to the success of the organization as well. So how are they contributing? Why is their role important? And if you're not clear on your role, I mentioned this already, ask, please
Yeah.
ask, get really clear on not just the expectations, but the contribution. What is the impact of your role? Why does it exist? Why is it important? And what role can you uniquely play in that as well? So that's, I think, really important, and it probably will tie into the next point that we'll talk about in a second. But find a way to connect with colleagues on a personal level. I received an email just this morning about Christmas parties. This was a UK study that was done, so it's not Irish, it's not US, it's not global, but this was about Christmas parties and most people not wanting to have a Christmas party anymore. And the biggest reason was because they had to interact with their colleagues and make small talk. Now, to
Oh no.
me, that's really sad. It's really sad if you don't want to have a Christmas party because it means you're going to have to talk to your colleagues. You know, like, so I think for me, it's important to connect with colleagues on a personal level, to understand what's on for them outside of work, not just the Netflix shows that you're working on, but, you know, what do they do in their spare time and what's their family setup? What's their situation? All of these things are really important, I think, for building relationships at work. And I get that some people are a bit more private. Some people want to keep work and life very separate. You don't have to spill the beans on everything, but I think it's a really nice way to be able to connect with people by getting to know them on a little bit more of a personal level. And then again in the chat, if you want to let us know, what are you thinking? How do you feel about your colleagues? So the
Yeah.
last of the needs areas is this idea of competence. And competence is feeling capable of doing your role. And again, it's about finding that balance. So I always like to think of it as a balance of challenge and support. So if you have too little competence in your role, you could be feeling like you're in over your head, like you don't know what you're doing, like you're going to be found out, that you're a total fraud. What are you doing here? That you don't feel that level of capability. And this can be a huge sign of imposter syndrome as well, something that I talk about all the time. So, imposter syndrome is this sense that it's beyond just self doubt, it's doubting your abilities to the extent that you're afraid that someone else is going to find you out. that you're going to be exposed as a fraud, that they're going to, the talent police are going to come knocking and say, we made a huge mistake. That promotion was supposed to go to someone else. That money was supposed to go to someone else. It's also this sense that you just got lucky. I was in the right place at the right time. They had no other option. And I've told myself these things over the years. I've experienced imposter syndrome multiple times before I even knew it had a name. And for me, I think it's something that shows up again and again, unless you take measures to address it, unless you can recognize the behaviors. And oftentimes they can be unconscious behaviors. So I forgot to reply to an email, or I forgot to take a specific action I needed to take in order to achieve
Yeah.
something I wanted to achieve, or you missed a deadline, or, things like this that can show up. On the other side of that, and I've also been in this situation, that you feel like I could do this job with my eyes closed. I don't feel challenged in any way. I don't feel like my skills are being utilized. And so it's about finding that challenge so that someone doesn't feel like they're totally incapable, but equally that they don't feel like they're completely bored in the role and that they have so much more to give. I did a LinkedIn poll. It's not exactly scientific, but I did a LinkedIn poll a number of years ago, and I asked people, do you feel like you're reaching your full potential at work? And it was something like 85% of people said no. And that surprised even me. And I work in this area. I was so surprised that so many people feel personally that they could contribute a lot more to the work that they're doing. And I think going back to, that there's two themes that are emerging from our conversation today. And one of those is about this idea of balance, but the other one is about listening. It's about actually listening on an
Yeah.
individual basis to what people are saying. And so having those conversations and understanding how can people contribute more, how do they think they can give more, how do they think they can bring more to the role, and not be stifled by the role that they're in, or the policies or the processes that you have in place, or not stamping on someone else's toes who's interested in doing that or whose role it is. There's all of these things that could block us, but how do we take those blocks away, and how do we tap
Yeah.
into the potential that already exists in our organizations? So, Sanja, I know you have some interesting stats to share around this as
I
well.
do, and we'll go quickly because we're almost out of time. So again, from the Question Pro study, and I realized I forgot to cite it on the bottom of slides, so I'll have to add that. Is there's a big one around being satisfied with where people are in their career, and this is an item that very often scores low on surveys. And so a lot of times you start to dig into learning and development and career progressions and how clear that is. But I would definitely, because you can see 31% satisfied with career and 29% satisfied with developing their skills, working with others, and then just a little bit more around manager offering helpful feedback. So there are definitely very specific areas. The career is a little bit bigger. The development and skill set and manager feedback are more actionable, but going in and understanding what are the different ways people's competence is built and where are the biggest opportunities in your organization will be really important. Again, there's some general trends that we're seeing, but then we also see organizations that do invest in integration between different teams, more learning and development programs where they tend to score a lot higher in those.
Yeah. And I think for me, something that we're not taught is how to manage our career strategically. Companies put
Um,
things in place, they have learning modules, they have all sorts of fancy tools that they can use from a HR perspective, but people don't know how to strategically think about how to manage their career. So that's my addition to that. So,
yeah.
from a competence perspective, it's about capability and feedback. And feedback is so, so important. Are you providing feedback on an ongoing basis? And is that feedback helpful? So, positive feedback always goes down really well, but are you giving positive feedback? And then constructive feedback, maybe ask permission, but make sure that it's people can actually use that as well. If you feel in over your head, can you seek out some support for imposter syndrome? Seek out and openly give feedback as well, where people are looking for feedback. Make sure that it's useful, that it's helpful. Look for new learning opportunities. Is there an opportunity to learn a new skill? AI is, I think, the top of everyone's tongues at the moment. How to use AI in roles and how to, getting an understanding of how to use AI to improve processes in your work as well. How can you improve your work? Where are the areas for improvement around processes, relationships, or the outcomes that you get? Record your accomplishments and celebrate your wins. That this is your big thing to do, because it's something I think a lot of us struggle with, is taking a record of what we've actually achieved and then taking time to pat ourselves on the back or to tell someone about it or to celebrate our wins in some small way.
Yeah. I love that one. That's like definitely a huge opportunity for me. So we can quickly go through these and start wrapping up because believe it or not,
Yeah,
our hour has already gone by. We
I
have a
know it's
few more
flown. It's
slides.
absolutely flown by. But yeah, just like I'll call out one here, which is recognition. And for me, I'm really surprised that it's not part of our basic needs. But maybe that's because I'm the kind of person I like to be recognized. I like to be publicly recognized, but not everyone is like that. So really, it's about understanding on an individual basis what unique needs that the individuals in your team have. And again, do people know what their needs are? Maybe not, but talk to them about where they're frustrated or where they need extra support or
Yeah.
what they'd like to see more of. And I'm sure they will be able to articulate what's going on for them. So, a list of some other needs, not an exhaustive list, but they are some things to think about that people might be frustrated about, or like they might need more of, or it's something that really brings a greater sense of happiness at work to them.
Yeah, love it. Um, and just to wrap up with some general action. So a lot of times when it comes to topics like these, we'll get asked, but is it like, am I responsible for it as an individual for myself? If I'm a manager, is this another thing that I should be responsible for my team? Or is this something an organization should take care of? And really it's all like it's not a, and usually that's the answer for most of these questions when we're asked like who's directly responsible. So I would say from an organization standpoint, we started talking about culture, values, like what is your promise, how are you bringing things to life, and how are you aligning what your actual values are to what the behavior in the organization is every day. And then, of course, had to do a plug-in for employee listening surveys because to me, I still believe it's not a substitute for individual conversations. I think we learn through so much through those, but it's a really incredible way to do a diagnostic or where your organization is really strong and where you're bringing that brand promise to life and really living up to the values. And maybe where are some of your organizational blind spots? So where are the areas that maybe you personally or a group, the leadership group feels like we're doing really well here. And then all of a sudden you hear from your employees that you're not excelling as much as you thought you were. Aoife, what do you think on the manager end?
Yeah, I think it's just facilitating that conversation based on the framework that we had. Why not open a conversation about employees' needs on that individual basis? I'm a huge advocate for listening as well. So whether you're doing that at a grander scale, the kind of company wide, or whether you're doing that one to one as a manager. And I think oftentimes we have the excuse that we just don't have time to have these conversations. But actually, if you make time, it will save you time in the long run because it'll ensure that employees are happier, that they're more productive, that they're more engaged, and that they stay in your organization. And just a reminder that each individual will have unique needs. So we talked about the universal needs. They will have different levels of needs for each of those. It's about getting that balance right, but then they will have additional unique needs that are unique to them as well.
Yeah. Do you want to wrap us up with individual?
Absolutely. So individually, then I think reflect what has sprung up for you during this conversation. Is there something that you feel that maybe you can address? Where are your needs not being met? What conversation do you need to have? How can you close that gap between what you're experiencing now? And do you have the language to understand why you're not feeling happiest at work right now and how you can improve that happiness. I think really self reflection and then having that conversation with someone who can impact on that, who can, whether that is asking, well, what exactly are those expectations? And, you know, can you set out really clear direction for me? Or, you know, it's really hard to speak to a micromanager, I know, but trying to address an issue of I maybe addressing their needs up front. I know that you need everything and being on the front foot with sending them through progress reports and whatever you need to keep them off your back. But being able to have that conversation about being micromanaged, I think, is something that is also an option as well, even though it's hard to hear.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We don't have time for Q&A. If anyone has any burning questions and you can stay a couple minutes, Aoife and I can stick around. You can drop them in the
Absolutely.
chat.
Yeah, yeah. I'd
Um,
love to know what resonated with people. Is there something that they're kind of like, aha, I'm going to do something differently. Oh, I didn't know about that before. Or this is
yeah.
maybe share what's one thing that you're going to do in the next 24 hours.
Yeah. And while you think about that, because I think some people probably had to drop where I'm seeing some drops and some drops on the hour for other
Yeah,
meetings. Just wanted to share our contact information again, because I know a lot of these. Hopefully some things are, things like Aoife was saying you can do pretty quickly or you can think about differently, whether it's, starting to jot down your accomplishments and gratitude or speaking up or, thinking about if you're in charge of employee listening, adding some different questions to the survey to maybe some bigger changes that are going to take a little bit longer. But as you think through all of that, please feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to reach out with any questions, anything you might want to talk through, any of your accomplishments. If you want to, say like, hey, I paid attention to this or we made this big change and I'm just so thrilled and I'd love to tell you about it. So maybe it becomes, we can tell your story in our continued conversation and others can celebrate your accomplishments and make sure to learn from you too. It would be our pleasure. So Aoife, thank you so much. I'm always internally grateful for your friendship, for your wisdom. Um, and oh, I have one. I just completed the question flow employee survey, and this really helps me. Thank you so much. Um, thank you. Thank you, April, for your comment. We're so glad that this was useful. Um, and again, Aoife, thank you. Thank you. Oh, we're getting more comments. I don't want to miss any of them.
feel like there's a delay.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. So Jason said, great discussion. Appreciate the 3 action items will help him filter depending on who he's sharing the content with. So thank you. Again, if you have any more comments, keep them coming. I'd love to. I think next time we'll have to make this, I don't know, an hour and 15 minutes. So we have a little bit more spillover time for the discussion. But thank you, Aoife. Thank you all of you who joined us. We know that agendas are incredibly busy. We have a lot of juggling priorities, but we're so happy that to have you in our circle and to have you as somebody who's equally as passionate about happiness in the workplace and making these things work as we are. So it's always so lovely to again build this community and be able to have these interactions with all of you. And Aoife, I know we'll be seeing you again soon. So incredibly
Definitely,
grateful for
yes.
your partnership, for your friendship, and for
Thank
everything that you
you.
do
And
to make
thank
the
you.
world a
No,
better place.
it's been fantastic in the run up. It's been a fantastic discussion in this. And I really hope that people have some actionable things that they can take from this conversation. Really, really appreciate your input as well. Thank you so much, Sonia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you soon. Thank you for joining us.